Adam Neely, a guy that needs no introduction on YouTube. Absolutely one of my favorite channels on the site, and my channel was in part inspired by him. He has a ton of knowledge to offer, and if you haven't seen his videos, I would highly recommend 99% of them. The reason that I say 99% is because there was that one video a long time ago that got my blood boiling a little bit. Now it goes without saying that this video is nearly a decade old, and thus it's possible he's changed his views quite a bit since then. But the video is still there, so I'd like to throw in my 2 cents on this topic. How and why classical musicians feel rhythms differently, and its subsequent video, Classical Musicians Still Feel Rhythm Differently, both linked in the description, was an attempt by Adam to explain his position that the rhythmic facilities of classical musicians fall short of the mark of musicians of other genres of music, such as rock, pop, or jazz. And as an orchestral double bassist, I disagree with almost all of it. So buckle up, I've got a lot to say about this. Also, please let me know what you think about this topic in the comments. I realize that this can be a contentious issue. I just ask that you watch the video all the way through before coming to a conclusion. Thanks. He begins the video by saying that the sense of rhythm of classical musicians can be left a little bit wanting when compared to jazz, rock, or pop musicians.
Very often, rhythmic facilities in classical musicians can be left a little bit wanting.
And then he breaks into an example to show us what he means. And this example is the first real gripe I have with this video, because it's fairly disingenuous.
For example, check out this actual instructional video from this double bass professor who teaches at the University of Washington, who talks about the importance of being able to accurately perform quarter note triplets. And then he doesn't quite accurately perform them.
There are a lot of places here where you have to play 3 against 2. So you have to do this da 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 da.
Now, that clip was not altered by Adam or myself in any way. This is an actual instructional video from a double bass professor. This video is part of a series of videos that was created to help students learn some of the common double bass orchestral excerpts and solos. The clip here was taken from his Pictures at an Exhibition demonstration. Now, I agree 100% with Adam that the execution of the quarter note triplets is clearly off, and this should not have been included in an instructional video. What makes this disingenuous is that if you scroll back in the same video about 15 seconds, the professor performs the quarter note triplets accurately with the metronome. So clearly when Adam implies that this guy is just incapable of playing quarter note triplets, it's incorrect. And then when he extrapolates that all classical musicians have wonky rhythm based on that clip, I think it's safe to say that this isn't correct either. So what happened here? Likely what happened is just a mistake. The professor was talking faster than he was thinking and made a mistake while demonstrating. I agree it should have been corrected for an instructional video, whether with an edit or another take, but it is not nearly enough evidence to show that classical musicians' rhythm is no good. And just to prove the point, just a quick note on this instructional video series. When I was a younger player, I walked into a lesson with a very good teacher and told them that I was using these exact instructional videos as a reference for my practice, and I was scolded for doing that. Apparently these videos were rife with mistakes because the recording process was expensive and they had to be done as quickly as possible. So there's a little context behind that. In this section, Adam goes through an experience he had with an unusual ensemble, a classical string quartet and a jazz band rhythm section playing together. And he details at first he felt as though the sight reading abilities and the musicianship of the classical ensemble was far beyond his own, because they were able to sight read through a bar that train wrecked the jazz musicians.
So my initial reaction to this, like most people's reactions are when they're confronted with the virtuosity of a well-trained classical musician, is that these musicians were simply superhumanly good sight readers of a caliber of musicianship far, far higher than mine.
And then he says that this illusion of their superior musicality was broken by the fact that the string ensemble was unable to play this rhythm, and that their inaccuracies had to be fixed in post-production of the recording session several months later.
This artifice was shattered quite spectacularly a couple months later when we actually went to record the music as part of our album Inside Outside. We used the same classical string quartet, and they performed most of the album quite brilliantly, but they had a lot of problem with this particular rhythm.
He explains that the music is in 9/8, but the unit pulse of the music is felt as if it's in 4/4 with an extra eighth note at the end. So 2 + 2 + 2 + 2 + 1. And he explains that a measure that was notated like a typical 9/8, 3 + 3 + 3, train wrecked the jazz musicians because it messed with the unit pulse of how they were feeling the music. What they saw and what they felt didn't match. but he says that the classical musicians were able to sight read through it no problem. The part that doesn't make sense to me is that he seems to be saying that the only reason the classical musicians didn't train wreck on this measure is because they were feeling the whole rest of the piece incorrectly in the first place. Or rather, they weren't feeling anything at all and were just reacting to the music.
Orchestral musicians will react to the ictus of a conductor's baton or a conductor's breathing, and then they'll count rhythms based upon the pulse that they are seeing. This might give some insight into why Wim's string quartet could sight read that music that was contrary to the pulse of the rhythm section.
Maybe they train wrecked on every other measure in the piece that was notated 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 1 up until the one that was notated in 3 plus 3 plus 3, and Adam just didn't mention that, but I don't think that's accurate. And we'll get more into this idea of feeling versus reacting in the next section, but just keep that in mind for now. He then says that the classical musicians were unable to perform this rhythm correctly.
With this particular rhythm, this 16th note syncopation, they could never really quite play cleanly.
Why might this be? Well, he's setting us up for a point that he's about to make, but let's speculate first. Not much context is given, but we can make a few guesses. Later in the video, he goes on to mention that string instruments do not have as sharp of an attack as something percussive, like a drum. So being precise to the 16th note could be challenging in that way, especially if you had to match a drummer at a fast tempo. But with an accent, strings usually can get a decent attack on a note, and I'm sure they could manage to line up with the drummer. It also could have been an issue of an awkward bowing or something happening in the music right before this rhythm to make the execution difficult. He states in his video that the string players ran into problems with this rhythm several months after the initial sight reading session in a recording session. I find it hard to believe that with several months of time for preparation that the string players would be unable to get this rhythm right unless there was something else in the music making it very difficult to do so, especially because he said they played the rest of the album beautifully.
One framework to understand this, and this is generalizing a little bit here, is that classical musicians react to the pulse and jazz, rock, pop, etc. musicians feel the pulse.
I'd say that this is more than generalizing just a little bit. This idea can be true in some instances, but it is certainly not true as a general principle. Most of the time we, or at least me, in the orchestra is feeling the pulse like a madman. In fast or complex passages, if you are not feeling or counting what's going on, you are either going to be wildly behind, trying to react to everything that's happening around you, or your rhythm in general is just going to be off. Imagine playing this Mendelssohn excerpt and trying to react to all of these entrances, instead of counting and feeling to know where you are. You are going to be behind on every single one. And then if you have any hope of being together with everyone else around you, assuming they're not counting or feeling either, they would have to be reacting at exactly the same speed you are, which I think is impossible. Everything would be a mess. Imagine trying to react your way through Stravinsky. If you're not counting, you are just going to get lost almost immediately. In very slow music, it may be even more important to count accurately. There is so much space between the conductor's beats that if you're not counting and feeling the subdivision accurately, you're just going to be guessing when your entrances are, and you will be wrong quite frequently. To give Adam a little credit, there are times where at least I am reacting a little bit rather than feeling the pulse. At the end of pieces or movements, when there are tutti chords, which happens a lot, I generally do not count during those sections. Instead, I look for cues from the concertmaster. This is because there are often tempo changes at the end of the piece, usually slowing down, but sometimes rushing forward, and everyone has to be together to finish the piece. Sometimes, depending on the type of tempo change, it can be very difficult to coordinate with, say, the 80 musicians that are on stage. You have to hope that everyone is either slowing down or speeding up at the same rate, and this can be tricky. Sometimes it can be easier to take a cue from a leader in the orchestra and follow their interpretation of what is happening. So in that instance, he might be right. Adam then argues that classical musicians do not have a good sense of phase locking, and then demonstrates this concept of phase locking with 2 metronomes.
So the result of all of this is classical musicians might have a good sense of rhythm, but not have a good sense of what's called phase locking. Check out these 2 metronomes, one on my phone and one on my iPad. They're both clicking away at 120 beats per minute, and yet they're not phase locked. The downbeats do not align with one another.
Again, I just have to wholeheartedly disagree with this sentiment. Again, he brings this up because of a point he's about to make. But before we do that, I just want everyone in my audience to try to intentionally play off of a metronome. I understand sometimes in our practice we make mistakes and get off unintentionally, but I want you to do it on purpose. Try setting a pulse and then playing just slightly off of it. Not metrically off of it like when you treat the offbeats as the pulse, but just slightly and see if you can maintain that. I certainly can't. If this were true and classical musicians could not phase lock, orchestral music would be a complete mess all of the time. Phase locking is what allows musicians to play together, so having 80 people on stage that could not lock in together would be a complete disaster. There is some nuance to this that he gets into a little later that has to do with attack and articulation that I do agree with, but first.
Watch this video of Leonard Bernstein conducting Mahler's Fifth Symphony. No, the video and audio are not out of sync in this one. This is an extreme example of where the orchestra and the conductor are not phase locked.
This is the example that he gives for the classical musician's lack of phase locking ability, where Bernstein is miles ahead of the trumpet soloist. Well, there's actually two things happening here. First, sometimes conductors will conduct ahead of the beat to show what they want. Pay attention to Bernstein's baton. He's conducting the rhythm he wants to hear from the trumpet ahead of time. And in this context, it's a solo. Nothing else is happening. The trumpet is simply waiting for his cue, and the conductor doesn't need to be in time. Because nothing else is going on, the trumpet and the conductor is at liberty to take as much or as little time as they would like. This would obviously be different if there were dozens of musicians trying to stay together. Adam mentions in his response video to this one that there are different kinds of conducting, and he is used to the kind of conducting where the orchestra is exactly with the beat of the conductor, such as in a Broadway show pit.
Broadway conducting, which is where I'm used to because I am playing in pits and playing in cabarets and stuff. And if I'm not exactly with where the conductor is placing his ictus, and usually the conductor, by the way, is the MD, I'm wrong. I'm off.
I would say even the same conductors will react differently in different musical situations. So Bernstein was incredibly far ahead of the trumpet solo in Mahler 5. But watch what happens when Bernstein is conducting a part of a piece where all the musicians have to be together. Here, in Beethoven 5, fourth movement, he is right with the beat. And in sections like this, if he was super far ahead of the beat, he would just be getting ignored by the musicians. They would instead be phase locking with each other instead of with the conductor. Adam partially retracts this statement in the second video after learning about why conductors conduct ahead sometimes.
Now, in my video, I show a rather unfair clip, I suppose, of Leonard Bernstein conducting Mahler's Fifth, and the orchestra is way behind, and I use that as an argument against classical musicians having a strong sense of an internal pulse. And I know that was a little bit of an unfair sort of argument.
But doesn't really mention that it has nothing to do with the classical musicians can't phase lock point. This is where he talks about the nature of string players' instruments not being percussive.
And the reason for this is that the initial attack transients of strings and woodwinds generally are fairly soft. If the initial attacks of each one of the notes are not 100% phase locked, it actually doesn't sound particularly bad.
And this is the nuance I was talking about from earlier. And this part is true. I've compared me starting a note on my bass to a percussive smack of a pen on my table, and you can see the difference. So yes, there may be a larger margin for error from a string instrument than a percussionist, especially if you're talking about a very soft section with light articulation. Under these circumstances, it is possible for string players to sneak in, and they may not be noticeable if they're a little bit behind. But what about a rhythmically driving section, or a section that has accents or tutti chords? Watch the waveform when I play an accent. It's still not as quick as a percussionist, but if you were off in a section like this, the flams created from the rhythmic dissonance would be noticeable. And this also, of course, has to do with the level of musicians you are playing with. In general, high-level orchestras have very little tolerance for players that are playing out of time. A wrong note or slip of intonation is forgiven much more quickly than a player dragging the rest of the section down with imprecise rhythm. And if it's high-level students or professionals that we are talking about, even though their instruments may allow for a small amount of imprecision, doesn't mean that they're not striving to be just as precise as the percussionist. They are still aware of when they are ahead or behind and will strive to be as rhythmically accurate as possible, even with the longer transient of attack of their instruments.
In string quartet music, for example, the rhythm sort of ebbs and flows, and it's a lot more fluid and goes with the melodic line. Is the pulse metronomic? No, of course not. If everything was completely even, it would sound very stilted and unmusical. So the music itself requires this very different understanding of rhythm as a whole, and so the musicians themselves are more apt to apply that understanding.
I agree with this here, that some music can call for ebb and flow in the rhythm, such as the Ravel string quartet he is showing. But in my opinion, in order to manipulate rhythm in this way, especially when you are doing so in a group of players instead of just on your own, you need to have a very strong understanding of pulse and subdivisions. They are not playing that way because they can't feel the pulse or they can't keep the rhythm steady, and they're able to do that because they have a very high level understanding of the rhythm. The main issue I have with this video is it's just too much generalization. He was correct on some points that may be true in some circumstances, but then he extrapolated that out to try and fit everyone within that genre of music to what he is saying. He says himself that he doesn't like it when classical musicians dismiss other genres of music, but he seems to be dismissing the rhythmic facilities of an entire genre himself. I think the real truth of it is, musicians that specialize in different genres of music hone in on and perfect the skills that are needed most in that genre, and thus may become more proficient at those skills than musicians of other genres. The idea of improvisation comes to mind first. On average, does a jazz musician have better improvisational skills than that of a classical musician? Yes. Why? Because they simply do it more often. They practice it more and they're more comfortable with it. Does that mean that classical musicians can't improvise? No. It just means that when they're presented with the opportunity to improvise, the classical musician will likely have to spend more time preparing for that event. They're just not as fluent in it. Same thing is true with rhythms. Are there some differences in the way that jazz and classical musicians feel rhythms? Yes, probably. But is it because one sense of rhythm is just far superior to the other? No. In general, they are asked to do different things on a regular basis and thus become proficient at those things. Music in general is something that is too big for one person to be good at everything. Yes, every good musician has great fundamental skills, and we have things in common, but we also have plenty that is different. Let's take an extreme example. Kendrick Lamar and the concertmaster of the Chicago Symphony, Robert Chen. I doubt anyone would argue that both of these people are great musicians. But if I took Kendrick and sat him down to play the concertmaster solo of Ein Heldenleben, or I took Robert and asked him to diss Drake at the Super Bowl, neither instance is going to go very well. I think a good musician is a person that develops the skills necessary to succeed in the genre of music that they are playing. I don't judge Kendrick by his inability to play the violin. I judge him by the standards of the genre he is in, and obviously using that metric, he's quite successful. And thus, I think directly comparing and contrasting the musical skills or people in different genres, while it can be fun, doesn't really tell us a whole lot and just starts a whole bunch of meaningless arguments. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed, please leave a like and subscribe. I have a ton of respect for Adam Neely, and even though I don't agree with this video, I still think he's a fantastic musician. See you next week.